All right. In this month of May, we're actually going to be doing kind of a series of standalone messages before the month of June, where we'll have a 3-week series as we head into the summer. And so today, I'd like to give you a sermon with the topic and the title, Seeing the Light. And it's really a man who encounters Jesus. And if you're visiting with us for the first time, or you're someone who's not a Christian here, this is a great Sunday to be here because we're talking about what does it mean when we encounter Jesus? How does he radically change our lives? And what does that mean for us today and how we actually live and flesh that out? And the story tells us, as Alistair was reading earlier, about this man who was born blind. Now, that's actually a significant detail because throughout the scriptures, what we see is Jesus actually encounters a number of people with different infirmities and a number of blind people as well. Now, the detail here that's shown to us is that he's actually born blind. Now, why is that significant? It's because, for instance, there's a blind person who Jesus also heals, where after Jesus heals a blind man, this blind man, he says, the people look like trees. Now, how would this blind man even know that someone looks like trees? It's because that person who was healed by Jesus probably could see prior to becoming blind, and then Jesus restores this sight. But the story here that we look at specifically is a man who's actually born blind. So he's never been able to see before. He has no idea or frame of reference of what color looks like or what people look like or what he himself even looks like. Now, for people in the ancient world, when it came to people with different infirmities and illnesses and sicknesses, especially if someone was born with it, there was a belief that those who were born with a sickness or infirmity, that person was either born with this infirmity because they sinned in the womb. So for instance, some rabbis used to teach that if someone was born with an infirmity, like while they're in the womb, maybe they got really angry and they punched their mom's belly or something, like it was a sin while they were in the womb. And as a result, what they're living with is actually a consequence of them sinning in the womb. So there was this belief then that either the baby sinned in the womb or the parents sinned. And because of the parents' sin, the consequences of that actually fell upon the child. So you can imagine then, here's a man who's born blind. So constantly, the stories that have been told about his life is a story of you are a mess up even before you were born. Not only you, but the family that you came from. And you can imagine how there's probably this back and forth between the parents and the child about like, whose fault is this? Well, we know it was someone's fault because we know this never happens where someone is born with this kind of infirmity. And yet here's this man who's been born blind. So he's carrying the weight and the ache of these labels that have been put on him. Now, it's interesting because as Jesus encounters him, the disciples have this question, which was probably a common question about suffering and difficulty. And here's the question. Who sinned? This man or his parents? Who sinned at birth, Jesus? Now, Jesus gives this remarkable reply. And it's a reply that relates to how in the world are we as people who claim to follow this Jesus person? What do Christians teach about suffering and difficulty in the world? Now, Jesus gives this answer. He says, neither of them sinned. Which again breaks the paradigm of what people thought about those who were born with infirmities. And Jesus actually says, but this is an opportunity for the glory of God to be revealed. In other words, this is what Jesus is saying. The idea of suffering and difficulty and who sinned and the consequences, that is a mystery that is too big probably for you and for me. But every moment of suffering, of difficulty, of trial is an opportunity for God's glory to be seen. In other words, whenever we encounter suffering and difficulty, whether you're a Christian or you're not, the idea is that each of these moments are opportunities for the glory of God to be seen through peace, through love, through kindness, through miracles, through something dynamic where we as people are to approach suffering and difficulty, not with this judgmental attitude towards those who are suffering, but instead with a heart of wanting to bring the love and kindness and peace of Jesus to them. Now, Jesus actually, so this is what he does. He says, this is what's going to happen. I am the light of the world. Now, Jesus ends up spitting on the ground. He makes some mud, and he takes this mud, and he rubs it on the man's. Can you imagine how this man must have felt? He's probably just like, whoa, who's touching me? And he feels the coolness, the sensation of mud being kind of wiped onto his eyes. And he's told from this Jesus person, and he's probably like, who are you? What are you doing? He's like, I'm Jesus. And I want you to take this mud off of your eyes by washing in the pool of Siloam. And can you imagine this man's like, he's like, all right, I'll do it. Where is the pool of Siloam? And I can imagine he's like, oh, just go that way. He's moving around. He's like bumping into people. People are like, what are you doing? Get away from me. He's just like, I'm looking for the pool of Siloam. I need to go there. So he goes, and constantly people are like, get away from me. It's that way. Hey, go that way. Just walk straight. Finally, he does whatever he can to get to the pool of Siloam. And can you imagine how he must have been feeling? Confused, conflicted, wondering, what in the world is going on? But his toes enter into the water. He feels the chill along his ankles, and he goes into this pool. And I can imagine he splashes in there. And he takes the water and he wipes the mud from his eyes. I know you didn't think my eyes could get that big. But nonetheless, right? Like he wipes the mud from his eyes. Can you imagine? Like, he's never seen anything before. Only descriptions in his own imagination what sight would look like. And the first thing he sees is his own reflection shining in the water. He looks up and he sees splashes of color. He sees trees. He sees the blue sky. He feels and he can see the brightness of the sun. And can you imagine? For the first time in his life, he's able to experience a sensation that he's always and only dreamed about. And here he is. I mean, can you imagine how excited he must have felt? He comes out of the water, right? And he's just like, oh my goodness, I can see. Like, I was born blind, now I can see. He runs into town. He goes to all the neighbors, and he's like, guys, I can see. And like the text tells us, the neighbors are just like, well, who are you? What are you talking about? He's like, guys, it's me. It's me. Remember the guy that you used to call a sinner all the time? That person who you thought was cursed by God? Guess what? I can see now, right? Like, I can see. I see you. Oh, that's how you look. Interesting. Like he's everything. He's processing all of this information just at one time. And meanwhile, all the neighbors are somewhat incredulous. They're like, wait a minute, are you sure? Is that really you? He's like, yes, it's me. It's the same guy who was begging. The same guy who was born, but I can see now. They're like, what happened? I'm like, well, it was this Jesus fellow. I'm sure you heard about him. He goes around, walking around, doing miracles, and he actually put mud on my eyes. I know it's really weird. He told me to go wash in the pool. I get into the pool, I washed, and now I can see. I was blind, but now I can see. Now, what's interesting is the way the neighbors react. It's kind of like, oh, wait, are you sure? Can you tell us again? And he's like, guys, what are you talking about? Can we throw a party or something? Like, this is amazing. This is extraordinary. Do you understand how deeply my life has changed now? I can see everything. Right? He's kissing everyone. Can you imagine? He's just so excited. And the neighbors are like, you know what? We need to talk to the Pharisees, the religious establishment, to see what they have to say about it. And he's just like, okay, cool. I'll talk to anyone. He goes to the religious establishment. And the Pharisees are like, what happened, sir? He goes, this man named Jesus, he took some mud and he put it on my eyes. He told me to wash. I washed and now I can see. It's amazing. He's a miracle worker. And the Pharisees are like, Jesus, And he's like, yeah, Jesus. I don't know much about him. All I know is that I was blind. I was born blind, but now I can see. The Pharisees are like, well, he did this on the Sabbath. He did this on a holy day. Like, Jesus is already suspect in our book, and we're not sure how legit this is. And so they huddle amongst each other. They begin to talk. And can you imagine this guy who's been born blind? He's probably just like, guys, hey, when are we going to throw a party? Like, I was blind, but now I can see. When are we going to throw a party? Guys, so, hey, just tell me what you think. And the Pharisees are just like, we need to deliberate. We're not sure if this is true. And they turn to the man and they say, you know what? We need to ask your parents about this. And can you imagine this man's like, my parents? Let's do it. I've been longing to tell my parents. He runs over. He takes whatever the Pharisees and the religious establishment over to see his parents. And he gets to his parents and he's like, Mom, Dad, I can see. Isn't this amazing? Look, I can see. And the parents, meanwhile, they see the religious establishment a bit taken aback and they're wondering, wait. Hold on, son. That is our son. They huddle together And the Pharisees come to them with this confrontational attitude. And the Pharisees are just like, is this your son? And they're like, yes. He's definitely our son. But we had nothing to do with this. We don't know any part of this story. Just ask him. We are not involved in this at all. And can you imagine this guy who's seeing for the first time? He's like, Mom, Dad, you know me. What do you mean you don't want anything to do with me? You know I've been blind since birth. Come on, what? I thought we were going to throw a party. Isn't this what we've been praying for all these years? And the parents are like, you know what? Yes, he is our son, but why don't you ask him? He's of age. We are no longer responsible. Oh, can you imagine the sinking feeling amongst this man? Like, what are you talking about? Mom, Dad, I was blind, but now I see. The Pharisees then ask again. They ask this man again, can you tell us what happened again? And he's like, I told you what happened. I told you that this Jesus fellow wiped mud on my eyes, told me to wash in the pool. I washed in the pool. I came out, now I can see. And the Pharisees are like, who do you think Jesus is? He's like, I don't know. Maybe he's a prophet. We know he's done something extraordinary, though, because I was blind, but now I see. That's all I know. And they're like, you know what? We still question everything that's happening here. And this man is just like, what are you talking about? When have we ever heard these kinds of stories where someone born blind has been healed and they can see? Only someone from God can do this. The Pharisees are so taken aback by this man's kind of statements that the Pharisees end up saying to him, how dare you lecture us? We are disciples of Moses. Who are you? Are you following him too? And this man is just like, listen, I don't know. All I know is I was blind, but now I see. And then check out what the text tells us. To this they replied, and they say this to this man, you were steeped in sin at birth. All the stories that you've heard throughout your life about how you are a sinner, how your parents are sinful, how you are not chosen by God. All of those things are true. How dare you lecture us? And look at what it says. They threw him out. The Greek word that's used is the word ekbalo. Can I hear you say ekbalo? Ekbalo is the word for casting out. Like casting out a demon. Can you imagine all this? All this man wanted to do was to celebrate. He just wanted to see. He's had the most miraculous encounter with Jesus. And here he is, ekbalo, cast out from the community. I can imagine he kind of, after the excitement and the adrenaline of this miraculous healing, he begins to see his own dirty hands and arms, and he notices his tattered clothing. He sees the cuts and the bruises from bumping into things because he could not see. He notices how everyone else is more well-kept and has nicer things on, and he begins to notice his hands and his withering kind of skin. I can imagine this man begins to think, I never thought seeing the light would hurt this much. I never thought that seeing the light would actually lead me straight into the darkness. He probably begins to think, man, I wish I had never met Jesus. Because frankly, before I had met Jesus, at least I knew where I was in the community. At least I was part of the community. At least I was part of something. At least I knew my role. But now, abandoned by neighbors, rejected by my own parents, and now ostracized from the people in power, I never thought seeing the light would hurt this much. You know, one of the most maddening things about the Christian journey is sometimes meeting Jesus actually leads us straight into the darkness. Sometimes doing everything right, sometimes when I've followed all the directions, I've done my best to honor God as much as possible. Sometimes when I've done everything I can to make Jesus the center and I just want to celebrate and throw a party, life actually gets harder and worse and more difficult. Sometimes seeing the light actually leads us right into the darkness. Have you ever been there before? You know, there's a story of King David. King David, who was a boy who, if you know the story of David and Goliath, he defeats Goliath in this amazing underdog story. And then praise is heaped upon David, and they say about David that David is this person who slays thousands and tens of thousands. And meanwhile, King Saul, who was the person who was too fearful to battle Goliath and the Philistines, King Saul gets incredibly jealous of David, who's been the shepherd boy. And so King Saul, out of his own jealousy, what he does is he goes and he tries to kill David. And so David is now on the run. And he's this young boy hiding from this king who's part of the same team. They're part of the same group. And yet the king is so threatened by David that he goes after David. Now what happens is they find themselves he's hiding in different caves. This King Saul is looking for him. There comes this one moment where King Saul is actually in a cave with David. And some of David's men are basically like, David, now's the time. He's in the cave. Now's the time. You strike him, you kill him. He's been after you this whole time. And what does David do? He actually cuts off a piece of Saul's robe without Saul knowing it. He takes this piece of his robe. Once Saul leaves the cave and goes from a safe distance, David comes out of the cave and he basically says, hey, King Saul, I want you to know this. God actually delivered you into my hands today. Today, I could have taken your life. You have consistently tried to come after me, but today I could have taken your life. Here is proof of that. In other words, David acts so honorably. He does the right thing. Now, you would think that King Saul, after this moment, would basically say, David, you are a righteous person. Come and be part of this whole movement together now. Come, David, forgive me for the ways that I've mistreated you. But that doesn't happen. What happens after that? King Saul actually goes after him again, trying to kill him. Has this ever happened to you where you feel like you've done everything right, and somehow you've been left in the darkness again? There's another story, a guy named Joseph, who's someone who wants to live with integrity. And so he's a servant in his master's home. And as a servant, though, he's actually being tempted by the wife of his master. And the wife of his master wants him to come to bed with her. And so he flees. He gets out of there. But this woman is so embarrassed by what happens, she ends up levying this charge against Joseph and basically saying, hey, he raped me. He took advantage of me. How could he do this to you, my husband and his master, and so on and so forth. Joseph, who's been falsely accused, gets thrown into prison for many years, wondering, this following God thing, this doing the right thing, this trying to be a follower has led me straight into the darkness. Have you ever been there before? In my journey with my own family, one of the biggest things that's been part of my journey that I'll talk about regularly here at our church has been my journey with my own parents, specifically my father, because of the pain and the violence that we grew up in at home. And so I remember in this kind of journey of getting to meet the living God and hearing the gospel, the good news that the gospel is what Jesus has done for us on our behalf. And he calls us now to be a people who love our enemies, to forgive those who persecute us, to be kind and to let go of bitterness and to be a loving, more just kind of people, a gracious kind of people. And so this message is just kind of being seeped into me, and I'm wrestling with some of the deepest wounds of my own life is against my dad and the ways that he's hurt me, hurt my mom, and hurt my brothers. And so I've been carrying this wound for many years. And so as I'm processing through this, I know there's this nagging sense that what God wants me to do, Drew, you got to forgive your dad. You need to forgive him. You need to love him. You need to show kindness to him. And so finally, after kind of, years of therapy and working up enough courage to finally talk to my dad about some of the pain that he's caused me, I finally muster up enough courage. And so I remember meeting with him and talking to him, and my heart, as I'm talking to him, my heart feels like it's going to leap out of my chest. Because here I am, afraid of this man, and yet at the same time, just kind of wrestling through everything that's happening. And so here I am talking to my dad, and I began to tell him, I said, Dad, the reason why I wanted to meet, because I know this is awkward, because we rarely ever had time to talk like this before. Most of the time I was running from you. And so here I am talking to my dad, and I'm like, Dad, I just want you to know, I've grown up with a significant wound, significant pain, because of how violent you were. And when you go after mom and go after us, just incredibly scary for me. And I need to tell you this because, number one, I want you to know how hurtful this was. And number two, I want you to know that I'm working through forgiving you. And my dad, it's this moment where he's listening to me share this. And the whole time I'm super scared that somehow he's going to react. But he doesn't react for a while. He lets me finish, which is unusual for him. And then he says to me, the reason I was so angry was because you were a bad son. In fact, I don't ever want to see you again. Don't ever contact me or come into my home again. And I remember being like, that didn't work out so great. I would end up not talking to my dad for a couple of years after that. Any overture I made to somehow reconcile with him was met with condescension and just, hey, don't ever contact me again. Has this ever happened to you where seeing the light actually leads straight into the darkness? Yeah, I shared this story a couple of weeks ago, and I just thought I'd share it again because it's one of those moments when I was a graduate student in seminary, which is a graduate school for people who are studying to be pastors. One of my last classes was a theology class, and I was 2 to 3 days late on finishing my last paper. And so I was 2 to 3 days late. The way that we used to do this is not through email, but we actually used to take these hard copies of our final papers, and we would go to the office of my professor, and there'd be a box there where all the final papers were. And so here I am 2 to 3 days late. I race over, I print out my final paper, I race over 2 to 3 days late. No one's in the office because it's finals week and everything else. And I go over to his office, and what I notice next to his office is there's a pile of paper there. It's everyone else's final assignment. So I got my paper, and I basically looked at that paper. I looked in his office. No one's there. It's completely dark. The hallway is empty. I kind of look around. look for cameras. No, I'm just kidding. And then I basically take my paper and I slipped it in the middle. And then I walked away like, I got like all this swagger now. I'm like, oh my goodness, God is gracious. How did he provide this? And then meanwhile, there's just this nagging. Like hey, you got to tell the truth. I'm like, He's like, hey, you're studying to be a pastor. Your paper was about God. Like, you got to tell the truth. I'm like, And then I remember just thinking, okay, fine. So I end up emailing my professor. I'm like, Dr. Lintz, I've so enjoyed this class. I'm just kidding, I didn't write that, but I was just like, whatever. Like, I just want you to know, I wrote my paper 2 to 3 days late, and I put it in the middle of the pile. But I want you to know I did that without telling you that it's actually 2 to 3 days late. Thank you, your humble student. No, I'm just kidding. Drew. And so I sent the email, and in this moment, I'm like, oh, God, my conscience is clear. I've done what you've asked me to do. You happy about this, God? Oh, yes, I know that Dr. Lintz is going to be merciful now, Almost immediately, Dr. Lintz emails me back. He goes, Drew, thank you so much for your honesty. I will mark you down 2 days late. You're so kind to do this. Have a great summer. I just remember receiving that email and being like, that didn't work out the way I kind of wanted it to. Have you ever been there? Seeing the light actually leads you straight into the darkness. Maybe you're a single person and you've been doing your best to remain in a position and a posture of integrity when it comes to your relationships and what you do with your body and how you respect your own physical needs and your kind of emotional needs. You're doing your best as a single person to live out in a faithful way the way of Jesus. And yet, there's all these pressures around you to make decisions, to give yourself away, to violate your own integrity when it comes to your boundaries. And you do this, and you just feel like the world has cast you out. Maybe you're someone who in your workplace, you're doing your best to not play that political game, but you're trying to be your best to be respectful and honest, and you're someone who's trying to work with integrity and not fudge on things. And in the midst of this, the world around you, there's this overwhelming pressure. The tidal wave of the world is telling you, hey, you don't have to be truthful in that regard. Hey, you can play this game too. Everyone else is doing it. And you feel like the world is casting you out. When it comes to your finances, you've done your best to be faithful with your finances, to be generous, to do all the things that God would want for you to be and do. And in the midst of it, there's this overwhelming anxiety and stress and this feeling that somehow God is not with you. And you feel like, man, sometimes seeing the light actually leads you right into the darkness. Maybe in your marriage or as a parent, you feel like you've done everything right. You're doing the best you can. And somehow that love and that kindness is unreciprocated. Or you feel like someone has just kind of shunned you. Or maybe your children have gone off in ways that you've prayed for them. You've done everything right. And yet, you find yourself saying, I never thought seeing the light would hurt this much. Have you ever been there? This is a fairly depressing message, I realize. And some of you are like, wow, this is really sad. But thankfully, this is actually not the end of the story. Because check this out. Look at what John tells us about this story. He says, if we could go back a slide, or go to the next slide, sorry. Yep. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, do you see what's happened here? He is cast out, and he's wondering, why in the world am I in this place with Jesus? And it says that Jesus, when he hears about the man, he looks for him, and he finds him. He finds him. Here's what this passage reveals to us. Though the world may cast you out, Jesus will find you. Though the world may cast you out, though you might be ostracized, feel alone and abandoned, and go through the valley, Jesus will find you. Though every impulse in you might feel like quitting, might want to abandon this whole Jesus thing, he says he will find you. Now, the greatest evidence of this, of course, and this is what Christians have taught throughout the years and throughout the centuries, is this: the God of the universe will show you that he will never leave you or forsake you, though you might go through your darkest valley. The God of the universe has demonstrated this because Jesus himself would go through the most contemptible darkness so that you might be welcomed into his marvelous light. You see, when he dies on the cross and utters the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? The feelings of abandonment, the feelings of alone, the feelings of utter darkness. See, he would experience that so that you and I would know the vastness of his love for us. The vastness and the seal of his promise that tells you that no matter what you go through, no matter what darkness you might face, Jesus will find you. And his light will be the most invincible thing in the world. And so here's the call for you and for me, wherever you are today. Will you trust? Will you trust in God? Will you trust him? Even when it's dark. You can go to the next slide. Will you trust him even when you're in the valley? Though the tsunami of what the world tells us to trust or to be defined by, when the tsunami of the ways that New York tells us that our ambition is to define us, that our success, that our money, that our title, when the tsunami of all of that comes at us, will you be someone who clings to Jesus? Will you trust him even when it's dark? When you're going through a season of difficulty, and the first thing you want to do is you want to turn to whatever thing you turn to when you get anxious and afraid, whether it's shopping, whether it's workaholism, whether it's an addiction, whatever it might be. Will you be someone who clings to Jesus? Will you trust in him? Will you continue to walk in his ways, even when it's dark? Believing that though the world may cast you and I out, he's going to come and find us. He will be there with us in the midst of even the darkest valleys. I remember going through one of the most difficult seasons in my life. Was a season of depression, and I've had different ones throughout the years. And there was one season of depression that I was struggling through where, I was going through a breakup, and we also had lost a couple of folks in our extended family. I just remember questioning everything, questioning God and stuff. And I remember coming across this song by a woman named Ginny Owens. And the name of the song is If You Want Me To. And Ginny Owens, I looked up her song. After I heard this song, I looked it up. And what I read about her was that she's actually someone who's blind. And she was blind because of a degenerative eye disease that continued to worsen until she could no longer see. But faith had been something that she clung to throughout her life. And she wrote this song, which I find myself in some of the most difficult seasons of my life that I continue to come back to. And here's the song, if we can put up the lyrics. It says, "The pathway is broken and the signs are unclear. And I don't know the reason why you brought me here. But just because you love me the way that you do, I'm going to walk through the valley if you want me to. Because I'm not who I was when I took my first step. I'm clinging to the promise you're not through with me yet. So if all of these trials bring me closer to you, then I will go through the fire if you want me to. It may not be the way I would have chosen when you lead me through a world that's not my home, but you never said it would be easy. You only said I'd never go alone. So when the whole world turns against me and I'm all by myself and I can't hear you answer my cries for help, I'll remember the suffering your love put me through, and I will go through the valley if you want me to.